I'm Amber Wilson, 29, a digital marketing specialist with an impressive resume and a smile that hides decades of pain. Most people see confidence when they look at me, but they don't see the scars left by Regina Thompson's public humiliation at our senior winter formal. What cut deeper, though, wasn't her cruelty, it was watching my parents stand silently against the wall, eyes averted, as I was destroyed. That moment shaped every relationship I've had since. It's taken years of therapy to understand why their silence hurt worse than her words. Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey of healing that might just help you recognize similar patterns in your own life. I grew up in a modest two-story house in Portland, Oregon, in a neighborhood where everyone had neatly trimmed lawns and seasonal decorations. From the outside, we were the picture-perfect American family, the accountant father, the elementary school secretary mother, and their only daughter who brought home straight A's. But perfection has a way of concealing the emptiness beneath. My father, Frank Wilson, approached parenting like he did his spreadsheets, with precision but no emotion. A tall man with salt and pepper hair, always combed perfectly to the side. He spoke in measured tones and rarely raised his voice. This wasn't necessarily a good thing. It meant he treated disappointment and pride with the same cool detachment. I remember bringing home my first perfect spelling test in second grade, my small hands trembling with excitement as I presented it to him at his mahogany desk in our living room. He glanced at it, nodded once, and said, "That's what happens when you study properly," before returning to his work. My mother, Laura, was different but equally distant in her own way. She had warm brown eyes and a smile she offered freely to everyone, her coworkers, neighbors, even strangers at the grocery store, but that warmth came with an intense aversion to conflict that bordered on pathological. Whenever tension arose in our house, she'd retreat to the kitchen and emerge with cookies or suggest we watch a movie, anything to avoid addressing the actual issue. She meant well, I think, but her constant deflection taught me that uncomfortable emotions were things to be buried rather than expressed. As their only child, I became an emotional contortionist from an early age, twisting myself into whatever shape might finally earn their approval. My report cards were immaculates, my room was spotless. I joined every academic club that might look good on a college application. Even as a middle schooler, I became obsessively self-sufficient, never asking for help with homework or emotional support after a hard day. In my young mind, I thought independence might be the key to finally unlocking their attention. Our family had rituals that looked normal but were infused with emotional absence. Sunday night dinners were when we'd all sit together at our oak dining table, and I was permitted to share one accomplishment from the week. My father would nod, my mother would say, "That's nice, dear," and then conversation would shift to practical matters: bills, schedule coordination, household repairs. Never feelings, never dreams, never fears. In elementary school, I gravitated toward friends with strong personalities. Looking back now, this pattern is painfully obvious. Stephanie Lewis, my first best friend, was a boisterous girl who decided everything we'd play and everywhere we'd go. Then came Brittany Chen, who assigned me roles in her elaborate recess games. I was comfortable following their lead because in my home I had never learned to assert my own desires. These friendships were dress rehearsals for Regina, though I didn't know it then. When I was 9, a group of 5th grade girls started making fun of my second-hand clothes. I told my parents one night at dinner, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained how they'd surrounded me on the playground. "Well, did you do something to provoke them?" my father asked, cutting his chicken into precise pieces. "Girls can be mean sometimes," my mother added with a forced smile. "Maybe take a different route to the playground tomorrow." That was it. No outrage on my behalf, no calls to the school, no sitting me down to assure me it wasn't my fault. Their response taught me a devastating lesson: if something bad happened to me, I was probably to blame, and the solution was to avoid rather than confront. I retreated into books and studies after that. If my parents wouldn't protect me, I'd build my own fortress of knowledge and achievements. The library became my sanctuary. Mrs. Parker, the school librarian, noticed my daily presence and started recommending photography books after seeing me admire the images. "You have a good eye, Amber," she told me, the first adult who seemed to see something special in me. Photography captured me immediately. I saved my allowance for months to buy a used digital camera from a pawn shop when I was 12. The first time I showed my parents a sunset I'd photographed from our backyard, carefully framed between 2 oak trees, my father remarked that it was a constructive hobby, while my mother said it was pretty before asking if I'd finished my math homework. I took their lukewarm response and framed it as encouragement in my mind. I became obsessed with capturing images not just of nature but of emotions on people's faces when they thought no one was looking. Perhaps I was trying to understand the expressions my own parents never showed me. By the time I finished middle school, I had a portfolio of decent photographs and a deeply ingrained belief that my worth was tied to my achievements rather than my inherent value as a person. I'd learned to be quiet, to observe rather than participate, and to expect minimal support from the adults who were supposed to protect me. What I didn't realize was how perfectly this conditioning had prepared me to be Regina Thompson's victim. Lincoln High School loomed before me on my first day of freshman year, a sprawling brick building with wide windows and a reputation for academic excellence. I'd spend the summer reinventing myself, at least in my imagination. I'd grown 2 inches, started using a strawberry-scented shampoo that made my auburn hair shine, and practiced smiling in the mirror until it looked almost natural. Average height, average weight, with a splash of freckles across my nose that I'd stopped trying to hide. I wasn't striking, but I wasn't invisible either. "This will be different," I whispered to myself as I climbed the steps that September morning, my camera safely tucked in my backpack. High school meant new beginnings, new people who hadn't known me as the quiet, studious girl who ate lunch alone. I'd signed up for the photography club before classes even started. That's where I met her. Regina Thompson swept into the first photography club meeting 10 minutes late, drawing every eye in the room. She had the kind of beauty that seemed effortless, glossy black hair that fell in perfect waves to the middle of her back, clear skin that glowed without makeup, and clothes that looked casual but probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. When she laughed, everyone leaned toward the sound like flowers following the sun. Mr. Bennett, our photography teacher and club advisor, asked us to share our favorite subjects to photograph. When my turn came, I nervously showed a black and white image of an elderly man feeding pigeons, his weathered face captured in a moment of pure joy. "I like to photograph emotions," I explained quietly, "the ones people don't think anyone notices." I expected the usual polite nods before attention moved to the next person. Instead, Regina spoke up. "That's actually amazing," she said, her voice carrying a confidence I couldn't imagine possessing. "Most people our age just take selfies or whatever. You've got like a real perspective." Heat rushed to my face at the unexpected praise. Mr. Bennett smiled and nodded in agreement, but I barely noticed. Regina Thompson had seen me, really seen me. After the meeting, she waited for me in the hallway. "You should show me more of your stuff sometime," she said, falling into step beside me as if we'd been friends for years. "I'm trying to develop my own style, but everything I shoot looks like an Instagram filter threw up on it." She laughed at her own joke, and I laughed too, dizzy with the sudden attention. When she suggested we exchange phone numbers, I fumbled with my outdated phone, suddenly self-conscious about its cracked screen. "Don't worry about it," Regina said, noticing my embarrassment. "My dad makes me wait until the new models come out. Corporate loyalty or whatever, he works for Apple." That casual reference to her father's prestigious job was the first glimpse of the social gulf between us. Regina lived in West Hills, Portland's most exclusive neighborhood, in a house that overlooked the city. Her father was an executive, her mother a former model who now ran a successful interior design business. They traveled to Europe every summer and had a vacation home in Aspen. When I mentioned Regina to my parents that night, their reaction was unusually animated. "Thompson, as in Martin Thompson's daughter?" my father asked, actually looking up from his tablet. "I think so," I said, surprised by his interest. "The Thompsons are very well connected," he noted, a hint of approval in his voice. "Her father's company is one of the largest accounts at my firm." My mother chimed in. "I met her mother at a school district function once. Very elegant woman. It's nice you're making friends with good families, Amber." For once, I'd done something right in their eyes, though it had nothing to do with me and everything to do with Regina's family name. Still, I savored their approval, however superficial. Within weeks, Regina had pulled me into her orbit completely. She introduced me to her inner circle: Mackenzie Price, a cheerleader with a sharp tongue and sharper fashion sense; Dylan Carter, a lacrosse player whose family owned half the car dealerships in Portland; and Jason Miller, the student body president whose college applications already included community service on 3 continents. I still don't know why Regina chose me. Perhaps she genuinely admired my photography. Maybe she needed someone who would look at her with unconditional admiration. Or possibly, as I would later suspect, she identified me early on as someone whose vulnerability made her feel powerful by comparison. Whatever her reasons, I was intoxicated by my sudden social elevation. For the first time, I wasn't eating lunch alone or spending Friday nights reading in my bedroom. I was at parties in houses with infinity pools, being introduced as my friend Amber. She's an amazing photographer by the most popular girl in school. Regina had a gift for making you feel like the most important person in the world when her attention was on you. She'd ask questions about my photography with genuine interest, remember details about my favorite books, and defend me when Mackenzie made subtle digs about my clothes or hair. Not everyone's parents believe in raising entitled brats, Mac should say with a laugh that somehow softened the rebuke, then she'd link her arm through mine in a show of solidarity that made my heart swell. I mistook these moments for true friendship. I didn't recognize them as the actions of someone collecting debts to be called in later emotional currency I would pay back with interest. There were warning signs, of course, the way Regina would occasionally forget to text me about a group hangout, how she'd sometimes interrupt me mid-sentence to point out a cute boy or complain about a teacher, the calculating look that flashed across her face when I received praise from others. Once, after Mr. Bennett displayed my photograph of a homeless man's hands in the school showcase, Regina pulled me aside. "It's really good, Amber, but you could be more than just the girl who takes depressing pictures of poor people. I could help you fit in better if you wanted." I nodded gratefully, interpreting her comment as concern rather than criticism. After years of my parents' emotional unavailability, Regina's attention, even when tinged with manipulation, felt like nourishment to my starving self-esteem. I was so desperate to maintain our friendship that I ignored the moments when her mask slipped, revealing something cold beneath. By the end of sophomore year, I had fully adapted to my role as Regina's faithful lieutenant. I carried her extra books between classes, laughed at all her jokes, and agreed with her assessments of everyone and everything. I had access to the social world I'd only observed from a distance before. But the price was my autonomy. I didn't realize I was trading one form of invisibility for another. My parents, meanwhile, seemed pleased with my new social connections. They never questioned why I always went to others' houses but never invited friends to ours, or why I sometimes came home quiet and withdrawn after weekends with the Thompson girl and her friends. As long as I maintained my grades and stayed out of trouble, they considered their parental duties fulfilled. What none of us knew was that I was being groomed not for friendship but for sacrifice. Junior year marked a turning point. I returned to school with a newfound confidence in my photography skills after spending the summer intern at a small local gallery. Mr. Bennett pulled me aside after the first photography club meeting of the year. "Amber, your portfolio has really evolved," he said, his eyes crinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I think you should consider entering the Northwest Young Artists Competition. The deadline's in November, and the winner gets a scholarship and a summer workshop in New York." My heart raced at the possibility. A prestigious competition could open doors to art schools I'd only dreamed about, but my excitement was immediately tempered by worry about Regina's reaction. When I tentatively mentioned the competition at lunch that day, Regina's response surprised me. "You absolutely have to enter," she declared, setting down her sparkling water. "Your stuff is way better than the pretentious crap that usually wins those things." Mackenzie raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. "Since when are you into art contests, Regina?" "Since my best friend turned out to be actually talented," Regina replied, squeezing my shoulder. "Besides, it'll look amazing on college applications." Her support felt genuine, and over the next few weeks, she even helped me select which photographs to include in my submission. She seemed particularly drawn to a series I'd taken of elderly people at a local retirement home, their faces alive with stories untold. "These have real emotion," she said as we sat cross-legged on her canopy bed surrounded by prints. "They make you feel something. That's what good art does." For once, I didn't feel like Regina's shadow but her equal, an artist whose work she respected. It was intoxicating. Around the same time, I developed a crush on Ethan Brooks, a quiet basketball player who shared my app literature class. Unlike the louder athletes who dominated the hallways, Ethan had a thoughtful quality that drew me to him. He quoted Kurt Vonnegut during class discussions and wrote poetry that our teacher, Miss S. Winters, occasionally asked him to read aloud. One October afternoon, as Regina and I walked to her car, I gathered my courage and confessed my feelings for him. "Ethan Brooks, really?" Regina's tone was more curious than judgmental. "I wouldn't have pegged him as your type." "He's different," I said, feeling my cheeks warm. "Yesterday he talked about how Slaughterhouse-Five is actually an elaborate love story. Who thinks like that?" Regina studied me for a moment, then smiled. "You know what? I can see it. You're both kind of deep or whatever. Let me help you get his attention." "No, that's okay," I said quickly, alarmed at the thought of Regina's direct approach to matchmaking. "I just wanted to tell someone." "Don't be silly," she insisted, unlocking her car with a beep. "Trust me, Amber, by winter formal, he'll be your date." I should have recognized the dangerous glint in her eye, but I was too caught up in the fantasy she was spinning me, on the arm of thoughtful, poetic Ethan Brooks. I'd spent so many years invisible that the prospect of being seen by someone I admired was overwhelming. Over the next few weeks, Regina's behavior began to shift in subtle ways. Her compliments took on a different tone, backhanded, with a sting beneath the surface. "That sweater is so brave," she'd say, eyeing my thrift store find. "I could never pull off something so unique." Or, "Your hair looks cute today. Did you try something different? It usually looks so flat." Each comment was delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, leaving me confused about whether I'd been complimented or insulted. I began second-guessing everything about myself: my clothes, my hair, my photography style, even the way I spoke. When I tried to discuss these changes with my parents over dinner one night, their response was predictably dismissive. "Teenage girls have their ups and downs," my mother said, serving more mashed potatoes I didn't ask for. "Regina's probably just stressed about college applications." My father didn't even look up from his plate. "That's just how friendships go at your age, everything's a drama." "But she's been saying things that make me feel terrible about myself," I pressed, desperate for them to understand. "Maybe she's just being honest," my father replied. "Sometimes we need friends who'll tell us hard truths." "Don't rock the boat, honey," my mother added, her perpetual advice for any conflict. "These friendships are important for your future." Once again I was being told that my feelings were less important than keeping the peace, that I should endure discomfort rather than address it directly. I retreated to my familiar pattern of making excuses for those who hurt me. Maybe Regina was just stressed. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe this was normal friend behavior that I was too socially inexperienced to understand. Meanwhile, Regina had begun asking increasingly personal questions during our late-night text conversations. "What's your biggest insecurity?" she asked one night. "I don't know," I hedged, uncomfortable with the question's directness. "Come on, everyone has one. Mine is my laugh. I think it sounds like a dying seal." Her self-deprecation, which I now recognize as a manipulation tactic, made me feel I needed to reciprocate with vulnerability. "I guess I worry I'm forgettable," I finally admitted, typing and deleting several times before hitting send, like I could disappear and no one would really notice. "That's deep," she replied immediately. "What else?" And so it continued, night after night, Regina mining my insecurities under the guise of deepening our friendship. I told her about my parents' emotional distance, my fear that my passion for photography was just a phase, my worry that I wasn't pretty enough for someone like Ethan to notice me. I didn't realize I was handing her ammunition. In November, the results of the Northwest Young Artists competition arrived. Mr. Bennett called me to his classroom during lunch period, his face betraying his excitement before he even spoke. "You're a finalist, Amber," he announced, handing me the official letter, one of 10 in the entire Northwest region. "The judges specifically mentioned your extraordinary empathy and technical skill in capturing human emotion." I stared at the letter, my vision blurring with tears of joy. Years of shooting photos no one seemed to care about had finally led to validation from people who understood art. When I shared the news with Regina after school, her smile seemed forced. "That's great," she said, her voice flat. "Really great." "They're going to display the finalists' work at the Portland Art Museum in January," I continued, too excited to notice her lack of enthusiasm. "There's going to be a reception and everything." "January's a long way off," Regina replied, suddenly very interested in her manicure. "Hey, speaking of events, have you thought about what you're wearing to winter formal?" The abrupt subject change should have been another warning sign, but I was too caught up in my own happiness to notice, and besides, Regina had promised to help me catch Ethan's eye at the dance. Why would I question her sudden interest in my formal attire? "Not really," I admitted. "Maybe that blue dress I wore to your birthday last year?" Regina's expression shifted to one of horror. "Absolutely not. That dress was fine for a house party, but winter formal is major. You need something that will make Ethan's jaw drop." She insisted we go shopping that weekend, guiding me toward dresses that were more revealing than I was comfortable with. When I finally selected a modest emerald green gown that complemented my auburn hair, Regina nodded approvingly. "Perfect, now we just need to sort out your makeup and hair. Don't worry, I'll help with everything." I left the mall feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. Regina's interest in my appearance for the dance seemed excessive, but I convinced myself it was just her way of being supportive. After all, she'd been the one to suggest I could catch Ethan's attention. What I didn't know was that in the weeks leading up to that shopping trip, Regina had been having her own private conversations with Ethan, conversations that had nothing to do with connecting us and everything to do with setting the stage for my humiliation. The results of the photography competition had accelerated her timeline. Regina Thompson couldn't stand in anyone's shadow, especially not her supposed best friends. She'd tolerated my small successes before, but recognition from a prestigious competition threatened the dynamic. She preferred Regina as the star, me as the faithful supporter. As winter formal approached, the trap was being set, and I was walking directly into it, blinded by hope and conditioned by years of emotional neglect to ignore the warning signs flashing all around me. December arrived with twinkling lights and a blanket of snow unusual for Portland. The winter formal was scheduled for the last Friday before holiday break, and the excitement at Lincoln High was palpable. For seniors like us, it was one of our last major dances before graduation. Regina had been unusually attentive in the weeks leading up to the dance. She insisted on coming over to my house the afternoon of the formal to help me get ready, something she'd never done before. My parents seemed almost giddy at having the Thompson girl in our modest home, my mother offering cookies and awkward small talk while my father actually emerged from his office to say hello. "Your parents are so cute," Regina said as we headed upstairs to my bedroom, her tone making it unclear whether this was a compliment or an insult. She carried a large makeup case and a bag from an expensive salon, ready for your transformation. For the next 2 hours, Regina worked on my appearance with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She curled my hair into loose waves, applied makeup that somehow enhanced my features while still looking natural, and helped me into the emerald dress we'd selected. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The girl staring back at me was polished, elegant, beautiful even. For once, I didn't feel like Regina's plain friend but someone who might actually belong at her side. "You look amazing," Regina declared, standing behind me in the mirror. She was stunning in a silver dress that hugged her figure perfectly. "Ethan won't be able to take his eyes off you." My stomach fluttered with nerves and excitement. "Has he said anything about me?" A strange smile flickered across Regina's face. "Let's just say he's definitely noticed you." We rode to the dance with Mackenzie and Dylan in his luxury SUV. The school gymnasium had been transformed with silver and blue decorations, fairy lights twinkling from the ceiling like stars. A professional photographer had set up near the entrance, capturing couples as they arrived. When Regina pulled me toward the photo area, I hesitated. "Shouldn't we wait for the whole group?" "Don't be silly," she insisted. "We need to document how gorgeous you look tonight." She posed with her arm around my waist, her smile radiant. I smiled too, still unable to shake the feeling that something was off about her excessive enthusiasm. Inside, the dance was already in full swing. Our group claimed a table near the dance floor, and I scanned the crowd for Ethan, my heart racing when I spotted him near the punch bowl with a few other basketball players. "Go say hi," Regina urged, nudging me. "I can't just walk up to him," I protested. "Fine, we'll go together." She grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the refreshment table, but stopped abruptly halfway there. "Actually, wait here for a second. I want to test the waters first." Before I could object, Regina had glided away, approaching Ethan with the confidence I so desperately lacked. I watched as she leaned close to say something in his ear, her hand resting casually on his arm. He looked in my direction, then quickly away, his expression unreadable from this distance. Regina returned moments later, her smile now tinged with what looked like sympathy. "He's just a little shy," she assured me. "Give him time to work up his courage." The evening progressed with dancing, laughing, and the usual high school drama unfolding in corners of the gym. My parents, who had volunteered as chaperones, stood against the far wall, occasionally scanning the room with disinterested expressions. I waved once, but they didn't notice or pretended not to. Around 10 o'clock, as the GD switched to a slower song, Regina suddenly took center stage. She climbed the few steps to the platform where the GD was set up and whispered something to him. He handed her the microphone with a confused shrug. "Hey everyone," Regina's voice rang out over the speakers. The music lowered, and the crowd turned toward her. "I hope you're all having an amazing night." Cheers erupted from the dance floor. I smiled, assuming this was Regina being her usual social butterfly self, perhaps making an announcement about the after-party at Mackenzie's house. "I want to take a moment to tell you all about something really special," she continued, her voice dripping with exaggerated sweetness. "My best friend Ember Wilson has been hiding a secret crush." My blood ran cold. The gymnasium seemed to tilt around me as all eyes turned in my direction. This wasn't happening. Regina wouldn't do this. "Ember's been absolutely obsessed with Ethan Brooks all year," Regina announced, her smile never wavering, writing his name in her journal, talking about him constantly, even taking secret photos of him during basketball practice. Super cute, right? Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak as my private feelings were broadcast to the entire senior class. So I decided to help my bestie out and asked Ethan what he thought about possibly dancing with Amber tonight. Regina paused dramatically, letting the tension build. I desperately looked toward Ethan, whose face had gone crimson with embarrassment. And do you know what he said? Regina's voice hardened slightly. He said, and I quote, "I would rather die than dance with Amber Wilson." The gymnasium erupted in shocked gasps and scattered laughter. I felt as though I'd been physically struck, my chest constricting so tightly I couldn't breathe. But Regina wasn't finished. At first I was like, wow, that's harsh, she continued, pacing the small platform with the confidence of a stand-up comedian. But then I thought about it, and honestly, I get it. She pulled her phone from a hidden pocket in her dress. Let me show you why. With a few taps, the large projection screen used for pep rallies lowered behind her. Somehow she had connected her phone to the display system. What appeared on the screen was a text conversation, my private messages to her about my insecurities, displayed in giant format for everyone to see. Amber thinks she's forgettable, Regina read aloud, her voice mockingly sad. She's worried no one would notice if she disappeared. The laughter grew louder. I stood paralyzed, tears streaming down my face as Regina continued her methodical destruction. Oh, and this is my favorite part, she said, scrolling through more messages. She's afraid she's not pretty enough for Ethan or anyone to like her. I mean, with that second-hand dress and drugstore makeup, can we blame her? She swiped to a new screen, photos of me that I'd never seen before, unflattering angles captured during unguarded moments, some obviously edited to make me look worse. There was even a picture of me changing in the locker room, my back to the camera but clearly identifiable by my auburn hair. Our little photographer doesn't like being in front of the camera much, Regina commented. Now we know why. Through my tears, I desperately looked toward where my parents stood against the wall. Surely now they would intervene. Surely they wouldn't let this continue. What I saw shattered something fundamental inside me. My father was staring at his shoes, deliberately not watching. My mother had turned sideways, pretending to adjust a nearby decoration. Neither made any move to stop what was happening or to come to my defense. Their silence was deafening. Mr. Bennett finally stepped forward, his face tight with anger as he strode toward the platform. That's enough, Regina, give me the microphone. But the damage was done. The room swam before me, faces blurring into a mass of grinning spectators enjoying my humiliation. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to escape. I ran, through the gymnasium doors, down the empty hallway, out into the December night where snow was falling in gentle flakes that melted instantly on my overheated skin. I didn't stop until I reached the student parking lot, collapsing onto a bench, sobs tearing from my throat in painful gasps. Minutes or hours later, I couldn't tell, I heard footsteps approaching. For one desperate moment, I thought it might be my parents coming to comfort me. Instead, it was Mr. Bennett, his face creased with concern as he draped his suit jacket over my shaking shoulders. I've called your parents, he said quietly, sitting beside me. They're bringing the car round. I couldn't speak, could barely nod through my tears. The betrayal was too enormous to process, not just Regina's calculated cruelty, but my parents' complete failure to protect me when I needed them most. Their silence had spoken volumes, and it had hurt worse than Regina's words ever could. The car ride home was silent except for the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers clearing away snowflakes. I sat in the back seat, Mr. Bennett's jacket still around my shoulders, staring out the window without seeing anything. My mother occasionally glanced back at me with an expression that seemed more embarrassed than concerned. My father drove with both hands gripping the wheel at precisely 10 and 2, his eyes never leaving the road. We were halfway home when he finally spoke. These things blow over, Amber, he said, his voice clinical and detached. In a week, someone else will do something to draw attention, and everyone will forget about tonight. I stared at the back of his head in disbelief. Was that really all he had to say? Not "I'm sorry we didn't help you" or "what Regina did was cruel and wrong"? My mother twisted in her seat to face me, her smile strained. How about we stop for ice cream? Baskin-Robbins might still be open. The absurdity of her suggestion, ice cream as a remedy for public humiliation, broke something inside me. All the years of swallowing my feelings, of accepting their emotional neglect as normal, suddenly crystallized into white-hot rage. Ice cream, I repeated, my voice hoarse from crying. You think ice cream is going to fix this? We pulled into our driveway, the automatic garage door rumbling open. As soon as the car stopped, I flung open my door and stormed into the house, not caring that I was still in my formal dress or that mascara streaked my face. My parents followed more slowly, exchanging glances that conveyed their mutual bewilderment at my behavior. In the kitchen, I spun to face them, no longer able to contain my fury. You saw what happened tonight, I said, my voice shaking. You saw Regina humiliate me in front of everyone. You were right there watching. My father loosened his tie, clearly uncomfortable with my direct confrontation. Ember, you're being dramatic. Dramatic, I cut him off, the word exploding from me. She displayed my private messages on a projection screen. She showed photos of me changing in the locker room. She told everyone Ethan said he'd rather die than dance with me. Lower your voice, he instructed, glancing toward the windows as if concerned the neighbors might hear. I will not lower my voice. For once in my life, I want you to hear me. Why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you stop her? You just stood there against the wall looking away like you were embarrassed to even know me. My mother stepped forward, wringing her hands. Honey, we didn't want to make a scene. Make a scene? Regina was making a scene. She was destroying me in front of everyone, and you were worried about making a scene? I grabbed a glass from the counter and hurled it into the sink, where it shattered satisfully. Both my parents flinched at the sound. Ember, my father's voice rose slightly, the closest he ever came to shouting. Control yourself. This kind of behavior solves nothing. And what would solve something? Pretending it didn't happen, avoiding the situation like you taught me to do with those girls in 5th grade, or maybe I should just go to my room and study harder, because that's all that matters to you. My father adjusted his glasses, his expression coldly analytical. You're being irrational. Regina's behavior was inappropriate, yes, but creating a public confrontation would only have drawn more attention to an already uncomfortable situation. This was a learning experience. A learning experience, I echoed in disbelief. What exactly am I supposed to learn from this, Dad? That it's okay for people to humiliate me, that my own parents won't defend me when I'm being attacked, that I'm completely on my own in this world? That's not fair, my mother interjected, tears welling in her eyes. We love you, Amber. Do you? Because love means protection. Love means standing up for someone when they're being hurt. Where was your love tonight when I needed it most? My mother's face crumpled and she fled the room, her sobbing audible as she retreated upstairs, running away from conflict as always. My father remained, his posture rigid. You're upset, and I understand that, but there are appropriate ways to handle situations like this, and throwing tantrums isn't one of them. How would you know? I asked, suddenly exhausted. You've never handled an emotional situation in your life. You just analyze and rationalize and keep everything at a safe distance. For a moment, something flickered across his face, hurt perhaps, or recognition, but it was quickly replaced by his usual stoic expression. We'll discuss this when you're calmer, he said, turning toward his office. Get some rest. That's it, I called after him. That's all you have to say to me? He paused in the doorway but didn't turn around. What happened tonight was unfortunate, but you'll move past it. As he disappeared into his office, I stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the fragments of the broken glass, a perfect metaphor for my shattered trust. In that moment, I realized a devastating truth: my parents weren't emotionally incapable of protecting me, they had chosen not to. I spent the weekend locked in my bedroom, ignoring my mother's attempts to coax me out with offers of food and shopping trips. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the night's events in excruciating detail. Regina's calculated betrayal, the faces of my classmates, some shocked, others amused, Ethan's embarrassment, my parents' averted gazes. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications, group chats I'd been added to, social media tags, messages from numbers I didn't recognize. I turned it off without reading any of them, unable to face whatever fresh humiliation Regina might have orchestrated in the digital realm. By Monday morning I had no choice but to return to school. My father's prediction that these things blow over proved woefully inaccurate. As I walked through the hallways, conversations stopped abruptly, followed by whispers and stifled laughter once I'd passed. Someone had printed screenshots of my private messages and taped them to my locker. Regina and her group sat at their usual lunch table, watching with satisfaction as I stood alone in the cafeteria, tray in hand, with nowhere to sit. The isolation was complete. No one wanted to associate with Regina's latest victim, either out of fear they'd be next or simple social self-preservation. Only Mr. Bennett offered any support, quietly telling me after class that his photography room was open during lunch if I needed a place to go. I accepted his offer gratefully, spending my lunch periods for the rest of senior year in that sanctuary, editing photos or simply sitting in silence while he worked at his desk, asking no questions but providing the adult presence I so desperately needed. Regina's campaign continued through graduation. Invitations to parties were rescinded, group projects became exercises in humiliation as no one wanted me in their group, college acceptance letters arrived, and I chose New York University specifically because it was as far from Portland as I could reasonably go. Through it all, my parents maintained their emotional distance. My father treated the situation like a business problem that would resolve itself with time. My mother tried in her ineffectual way to comfort me with material things, new clothes, offers to redecorate my room, suggestions for haircuts that might make me feel better. Neither of them ever acknowledged their failure to protect me that night. Neither seemed to understand that their silence had wounded me more deeply than Regina's cruelty. The night before I left for New York, my parents took me to dinner at an expensive restaurant downtown, their version of a meaningful goodbye. My father ordered champagne, technically illegal but overlooked by the waiter who recognized him as a regular. To new beginnings, he toasted, raising his glass. You won't know what hit them. My mother reached across the table to squeeze my hand. We're so proud of you, honey, and we're going to miss you terribly. I looked at them both, these strangers who had raised me, who had given me everything except the one thing I needed most, emotional protection when I was at my most vulnerable. Part of me wanted to make a scene, to demand even now, months later, an acknowledgement of what they had done or failed to do. Instead, I clinked my glass against theirs and smiled emptily. Thank you for dinner. The next day, I boarded a plane to New York, leaving behind the ruins of my high school life and parents who had taught me the most painful lesson of all, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most will stand by and watch as you're destroyed. Their silence of betrayal more profound than any words could ever be. New York embraced me in its chaotic anonymity. After graduation from NU, I secured a position at a digital marketing firm in Manhattan, leveraging my photography skills and aesthetic eye into a career that paid well enough for a decent apartment in Brooklyn. From the outside, I had all the markers of success: interesting job, independent life in a vibrant city, stylish wardrobe that had finally replaced the thrift store finds of my adolescence. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, the wounds inflicted that night at Winter Formal festered. Though I was no longer physically in Regina's orbit or under my parents' roof, the patterns established by those relationships followed me like persistent shadows. My colleague Stephanie invited me to happy hour during my first week at the firm. The whole creative team goes on Thursdays, she explained, her smile genuine. Best way to get to know everyone. I agreed automatically, then spent the entire day anxious about what to wear, what to say, how to ensure I wouldn't become the target of ridicule. When I arrived at the bar, I positioned myself at the edge of the group, laughing at jokes but offering little of my own personality. I was there but not present, a habit formed from years of trying to be invisible enough to avoid becoming a target. Romantic relationships proved even more challenging. My first serious boyfriend in New York was Derek, a finance guy who lived in a luxury high-rise with views of the East River. He was charming, successful, and incredibly dismissive of my opinions and feelings, a fact I ignored because his interest in me felt like validation. You're being too sensitive, he'd say when I objected to his canceling plans at the last minute, or I'm just teasing after making cutting remarks about my appearance in front of his friends. I accepted his behavior because it felt familiar, the emotional neglect echoing my parents, the occasional cruelty reminiscent of Regina. I had been conditioned to believe this was what relationships looked like: one person's needs subordinated to another's, boundaries ignored or trampled, emotional support withheld rather than freely given. The relationship lasted 2 years before I finally ended it, not because I recognized its toxicity but because Derek got bored and started treating me with such obvious disdain that even I couldn't ignore it anymore. Work relationships followed a similar pattern. I was drawn to work friends who reminded me of Regina, charismatic, often manipulative people who would befriend me only to use my ideas or take credit for my work. Bailey Matthews was the worst of these, a senior designer who initially took me under her wing only to present my campaign concept to executives as her own, earning a promotion while I watched silently from the conference room. When our creative director later asked me why I hadn't spoken up about the campaign being my idea, I had no answer that made sense even to myself. The truth was too complicated to explain that I had been trained to accept betrayal as the natural conclusion to trust. My professional persona became a study in contradictions. In client meetings, I could confidently present strategies and defend my creative choices with articulate precision, but when faced with personal conflict, a coworker encroaching on my responsibilities, a friend canceling plans repeatedly, I retreated into passive acceptance, the fight or flight response permanently stuck on flight. The most visible symptom of my unhealed trauma was the panic attacks that began in my late 20s. The first one hit during a team meeting when Bailey contradicted me in front of a client, dismissing my market research with a casual, "That's not really how it works." The room suddenly seemed to shrink, my heartbeat accelerated to a painful rhythm, and I couldn't catch my breath. I excused myself and spent 20 minutes in the bathroom stall, fighting the certainty that I was dying. After the third such episode, I finally sought help. Dr. Harper's office was a calm space of muted colors and soft lighting, nothing like the clinical sterility I had expected from therapy. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through my carefully constructed defenses. "Tell me about when these panic attacks started," she said during our first session, her voice neither pushy nor placating. I described the meeting incident, then others that followed. The time a date criticized my choice of restaurant, the confrontation with a neighbor over a package delivery. Dr. Harper listened attentively, nodding occasionally but offering no immediate analysis. "And these feelings of panic, have you experienced anything similar before your 20s? The question triggered a vivid flashback to the gymnasium, to Regina's voice over the speakers, to my desperate search for my parents' faces in the crowd. "Yes," I admitted, the word barely audible in high school. Over the next several months, Dr. Harper guided me through the painful process of excavating my past. I told her about Regina, about the systematic dismantling of my self-worth, about the public humiliation that had defined the end of my high school experience. But it was when I described my parents' reaction or lack thereof that Dr. Harper leaned forward, her expression intensifying. "You've mentioned your parents' emotional distance several times," she noted. "But this incident at the dance represents something different, doesn't it? This wasn't just emotional unavailability, this was active betrayal through inaction." Her naming of what had happened struck me with the force of revelation. Yes, that was exactly it, betrayal through inaction. My parents had been present, had witnessed my destruction, and had chosen to look away. "What's interesting," Dr. Harper continued, "is how these dual betrayals by Regina and by your parents have shaped your attachment style. You gravitate toward people who are emotionally unavailable or outright manipulative because that dynamic feels familiar. You expect betrayal, so you either choose relationships where betrayal is inevitable, or you perceive betrayal where it doesn't exist." "So I'm the problem?" I asked, defensive. "No," she replied firmly. "You were a child who experienced profound rejection from the people who should have protected you. You developed coping mechanisms that helped you survive that environment. But those same mechanisms are now preventing you from forming healthy relationships as an adult." The breakthrough came during a session focused specifically on my parents' role in my trauma. Dr. Harper asked me to articulate what I wished they had done differently that night. "I wish they had stopped Regina," I said immediately, taken the microphone away, escorted me out, anything other than just standing there. "And what would that have meant to you, if they had intervened?" I closed my eyes, imagining an alternate reality where my father strode purposefully to the platform, where my mother wrapped a protective arm around my shoulders and led me away from the cruelty. "It would have meant I mattered," I whispered, tears sliding down my cheeks, "that I was worth defending, that I wasn't alone." Dr. Harper nodded. "That's the core wound here, Amber, not just Regina's cruelty but the message your parents' inaction sent, that you weren't worth protecting, and you've been carrying that belief into every relationship since." The realization was both devastating and liberating. For years I had focused my anger on Regina, the obvious villain in my story, but the deeper wound, the one that continued to shape my adult life, came from my parents' betrayal, their silent communication that I wasn't worth the discomfort of conflict, that maintaining social appearances mattered more than my emotional well-being. As the sessions progressed, Dr. Harper suggested something I had been avoiding for years, confronting my parents about what had happened. "You've never had a real conversation with them about that night," she pointed out. "You expressed your immediate anger, but there was no resolution, no acknowledgement from them about how their actions affected you." "What's the point?" I asked. "It was over a decade ago. They probably don't even remember it the same way I do." "The point isn't to change the past," Dr. Harper explained. "It's to give your adult self a chance to advocate for your teenage self in a way no one did then. and maybe, just maybe, to give your parents an opportunity to see the impact of their choices. I resisted the idea for weeks. My communication with my parents had dwindled to obligatory holiday calls and occasional emails. I had declined their invitations to visit Portland for 3 consecutive Christmases, citing work commitments or fabricated travel plans with friends. The thought of voluntarily returning to their house, of making myself vulnerable again, was terrifying. But after a particularly severe panic attack following a confrontation with a difficult client, a middle-aged man whose dismissive tone had triggered all my old insecurities, I realized I couldn't continue this way. The past was not past, it lived in my body, erupting in moments of crisis, sabotaging my attempts at connection and intimacy. With trembling fingers, I called my mother and told her I'd be coming home for Christmas. Her surprise and delight only increased my anxiety. She had no idea what I was planning to discuss, how I intended to disrupt the carefully maintained fiction that we were a normal, loving family who had simply drifted apart due to geographic distance. On the flight to Portland, I rehearsed what I would say, the points Dr. Harper and I had outlined together. Be specific about the incident. Focus on how their actions made you feel, not accusatory statements about their character. Allow for the possibility of growth and change. Remember that the goal is healing, not revenge. As the plane began its descent over the familiar landscape of my childhood, I pressed my forehead against the cold window and made a silent promise to my teenage self. This time, someone would stand up for her. This time, her pain would not be ignored. This time, that someone would be me. My childhood home looked exactly as I remembered it, the same neatly trimmed lawn despite December's chill, the same wreath on the front door, the same sterile perfection that had always prioritized appearances over emotional authenticity. My mother opened the door before I could ring the bell, her face alight with a joy that seemed both genuine and unfamiliar. She'd aged in the years since I'd last seen her, more silver threading through her brown hair, deeper lines around her eyes, but her smile was the same, warm yet somehow never quite reaching her eyes. "Ember," she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that I returned stiffly, "we've missed you so much." My father appeared behind her, nodding in greeting. "Good flight?" he asked, the same question he'd asked after every journey I'd ever taken, as if flight quality was the most pressing concern after years of minimal contact. "Fine," I replied, stepping into the house that no longer felt like home. The next 24 hours unfolded in a surreal haze of forced normalcy. My mother had preserved my childhood bedroom like a museum exhibit, unchanged right down to the photography awards displayed on the bookshelf. My father inquired about my job with the detached interest of someone discussing a moderately engaging newspaper article. We exchanged information but not feelings, facts but not truths, the Wilson family specialty. Christmas Eve dinner was a more elaborate version of our old Sunday meals: roast beef, mashed potatoes, asparagus arranged precisely on Wedgwood china that only came out for special occasions. My mother filled silences with cheerful commentary about neighbors I no longer remembered, while my father occasionally interjected with questions about New York real estate prices or my company's client roster. I picked at my food, the rehearsed speech burning in my throat like bile. "Now," I told myself, "do it now before you lose your nerve." "Do you remember my senior winter formal?" I asked abruptly, interrupting my mother's story about Mrs. Henderson's garden renovation. The sudden shift in topic created a palpable tension. My father's fork paused midway to his mouth. My mother's smile froze, then faltered. "That was a long time ago," she said after a moment, reaching for her water glass. 13 years, I agreed, but I remember it like it was yesterday, especially the part where Regina Thompson humiliated me in front of the entire senior class while you both stood by and did nothing. My father set down his fork with deliberate care. "Ember, is this really appropriate dinner conversation?" "When would it be appropriate, Dad? Because we've had 13 years of Christmas dinners, birthday calls, and graduation celebrations where it wasn't mentioned. 13 years where we've pretended that night didn't permanently alter who I am and how I move through the world." "You're being dramatic," he said, the same dismissal he'd offered the night it happened. "That incident was unfortunate, but—" "Unfortunate," I repeated, my voice rising despite my determination to remain calm. Regina displayed my private messages on a projector screen. She showed unauthorized photos of me changing clothes. She told everyone Ethan Brooks said he'd rather die than dance with me. And you, both of you, stood against that wall and looked away while it happened, like you were embarrassed to be associated with me. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "That's not fair, Amber. We didn't know what to do." "You could have done anything," I replied, my voice breaking, taken the microphone away from her, pulled the plug on the projector, walked me out of there with your arms around me, Literally anything would have been better than nothing. Making a scene would only have drawn more attention, my father began. Stop saying that. I slammed my palm against the table, making the silverware jump. A scene was already happening. I was already the center of attention in the worst possible way. You weren't protecting me from embarrassment, you were protecting yourselves from discomfort. Silence fell over the table. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, tiny flakes illuminated by the street lamp visible through the dining room window. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, my father removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture I recognized from childhood as signaling rare emotional distress. "You're right," he said quietly, "we failed you that night." The simple acknowledgement, so long withheld, left me momentarily speechless. "My father," he continued, his voice taking on a quality I'd never heard before, reflective, almost vulnerable, believed that emotional displays were a sign of weakness. When I cried after breaking my arm at age 8, he told me to be a man. When my dog died, I wasn't permitted to grieve openly. I was taught that control was everything, that feelings were messy distractions from what really mattered: achievement, respectability, success. He looked up at me, his eyes revealing a pain I'd never been allowed to see before. "I thought I was giving you strength by teaching you emotional restraint. I didn't realize I was teaching you that your feelings didn't matter." My mother reached across the table, not for me but for my father's hand. "I was raised to keep the peace at all costs," she added, her voice thin and wavering. "My parents fought constantly, viciously. I promised myself my home would never be like that. But in avoiding conflict, she turned to me, tears spilling freely now, "I left you to face cruelty alone. I've been ashamed of that night for years." "Then why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked, my own tears threatening to fall. "Why didn't you acknowledge what happened, apologize, anything?" "Because acknowledging it meant facing our failure," my father admitted. "It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened, or that it wasn't as serious as it was. Easier for us, not for you. I see that now. We thought we were protecting you from conflict," my mother added, "but we were really protecting ourselves from discomfort, and there hasn't been a day I haven't regretted it." The admission, so long overdue, so desperately needed, broke something open inside me. Years of suppressed grief poured out in heaving sobs that bent me double in my chair. Without hesitation, my mother moved to kneel beside me, her arms encircling my shoulders. After a moment's pause, my father joined her, his hand awkwardly patting my back in what I recognized as his version of tenderness. "I'm so sorry, Amber," my mother whispered against my hair, "so very sorry we let you down." "We can't change what happened," my father added, his voice rough with emotion I'd never heard him express, "but if you'll let us, we'd like to try to be better parents now." It wasn't a perfect resolution. Years of emotional patterns couldn't be undone in a single conversation. My parents were still the same people, shaped by their own upbringings and limitations, but for perhaps the first time, they had seen me, really seen me, and acknowledged my pain as real and significant. We spent the rest of Christmas Eve talking more openly than we ever had before. I told them about my panic attacks, about my patterns in relationships, about the therapy that was slowly helping me rebuild my sense of self-worth. They listened without defensiveness, occasionally asking questions that showed they were truly trying to understand. When I returned to New York after the holidays, I carried with me something I hadn't expected: a fragile hope that relationships could change, that old wounds could begin to heal, that silence could give way to truth. 6 months later, I found myself standing up to Marshall Davidson, a notoriously difficult client who had dismissed my entire campaign strategy with a condescending wave of his hand. In the past, I would have acquiesced immediately, reworking the entire project to meet his arbitrary demands while swallowing my expertise and resentment. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "I understand you have concerns, Marshall, but I stand by this strategy. The market research supports it, and I believe it's the strongest approach for your brand. I'm happy to explain my reasoning in more detail." The conference room fell silent. My colleague Stephanie gave me a subtle thumbs up under the table. Marshall stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "convince me." That small victory, standing my ground without apology, was followed by others. I began setting boundaries with friends who consistently canceled plans. I stopped volunteering for extra work without recognition. I started a tentative friendship with Stephanie, one based on mutual respect rather than the power imbalances I'd always accepted before. I reconnected with Mr. Bennett, now retired but still active in the Portland arts community. "I always knew you had fight in you," he told me during a video call, his familiar kind eyes crinkling behind new, more stylish glasses. "Sometimes it just takes longer to find it." With his encouragement, I began shooting photography again on weekends, not for profit or recognition, but for the pure joy of capturing moments that moved me. Some of those images now hang in my apartment, reminders of the creative voice Regina had tried to silence. My relationship with my parents continued to evolve, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with surprising moments of connection. Our weekly phone calls weren't always easy, but they were honest in a way they had never been before. For my 30th birthday, they sent me a card with a handwritten note that ended, "We're learning to be the parents you deserved all along. Thank you for giving us that chance." The wounds of that winter formal will never completely disappear. Regina's cruelty and my parents' silence shaped critical years of my development, influencing patterns of thought and behavior that required conscious effort to redirect. But I've come to understand that healing doesn't mean erasing the past, it means integrating it into a larger story where those painful chapters don't have the final word. I now know that parental silence can wound more deeply than active cruelty. When those who are supposed to protect us stand by and watch our destruction, they communicate something profound about our worth. But I also know this now: that message was wrong. I was always worth defending, always worth fighting for, and learning to be my own defender, my own advocate, has been the most powerful reclamation of all. If you're watching this and something in my story resonates with you, if you've experienced betrayal by silence, if you're carrying the weight of old wounds that still affect your present, I want you to know that healing is possible. Not perfect, not complete, but real and meaningful nonetheless. The cycles of emotional neglect can be broken. The voice that was silenced can learn to speak again more powerfully than before. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone's silence hurt more than harsh words? Share your story in the comments if you feel comfortable. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these experiences can be the first step toward healing. And if this story meant something to you, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear that their pain matters, that they deserve to be seen and defended, that it's never too late to reclaim their voice. Thank you for witnessing my story. In a world that too often responds to pain with silence, your willingness to listen is a gift I don't take for granted.